Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, in this discussion series about democratic resilience in Europe. IFES is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that supports electoral processes very broadly defined across the world, and we have assisted elections in European countries since the fall of the Iron Curtain. This is the 21st installment in our discussion series. We've covered issues from inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of the Russian government in European elections and democracy. If you have missed any of our previous discussions, you can find recordings of all of them on our YouTube channel. My colleague is putting a link to that in the chat now. I'm Magnus Öhman. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the IFES Regional Europe Office here in the Czech Republic, and we are hosting this discussion. And this event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible for the generous support of the American people. Freedom of speech is essential for democratic processes and for competitive elections across Europe. But increasingly, different political actors are using a tool that we call strategic lawsuits or litigation against political participation. Strategic lawsuits against political participation. We call that SLAP. You'll hear the acronym SLAP a lot in this discussion. They then use SLAPs against journalists, civil society activists, human rights defenders to stop them from freely expressing their political views and opinions, opening the way for disinformation from both domestic and foreign actors. The goal with these SLAPs is often not to win a case in court, but to harass, to intimidate, and to financially and psychologically exhaust the opponent via improper means. In this online discussion, experts and practitioners will help us to understand what SLAPs are, why they are a problem within the context of freedom of expression, and how we can most effectively counteract SLAPs in Europe today and in the future. So with us in this discussion today, we have Oleg Khomenok, the Senior Media Advisor at Internews, also a member of the Board of Directors of the Global Investigative Journalism Network, a long-term experienced journalist originally from Ukraine. We have Anna Myers, Executive Director of the Whistleblowing International Network, and a member of the Steering Committee for the Coalition Against SLAPs in Europe. We will also be talking to Rubina Čengić, journalist and media consultant, again, highly experienced journalist based in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And to emphasize, Rubina will be speaking in Bosnian. So everyone who wants to follow her responses through English interpretation will need to use the interpretation button. You should find a globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click that and select English. If you don't see a globe, it depends on the device you're using, you should see 3 dots. Click on that and I will allow you to pick English so you can follow that discussion. You can do that already now. We'll also have Amr Elchahabi, Deputy Country Director for Tunisia and a Media Development Program Designer for IFES. And we will be talking to Nick Williams, Policy and Campaigns Officer at the Index of Censorship. After that, we'll open for questions for our panelists for a discussion. If you have any questions, you can already now type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let me direct the first question to Samar Elchahabi, Deputy Country Director for Tunisia and Media Development Program Designer at IFES. Samar, we need your help. What is a SLAP? Can you help us to understand the concept of strategic lawsuits against political participation?
Thank you, Magnus. Hello, everyone. So as you refer to, slaps are lawsuits brought by a party that doesn't care so much about winning as about punishing the other party with legal fees or legal expenses, and also emotional harassment, so long as the litigation may be made to last. So these sorts of abusive lawsuits were traditionally known as strike suits, but in more times they have become known as slap suits. So there are many different definitions, and we could spend pretty much this entire session just talking about that. However, if we draw on the definition by the Coalition Against Slaps in Europe, a slap is an abusive lawsuit filed by a private party with the purpose of silencing critical speech. This focus on private parties means that slaps are separate from more traditional forms of state censorship. However, it should be noted that slaps may be brought by state actors in a private capacity. It depends a bit on the legal and political context of different countries. And a very common scenario is where a journalist writes, for instance, an article, although perfectly true, displeases somebody very wealthy and or close to power. And to try to force a retraction of the article, the wealthy person brings a defamation lawsuit against the journalist with the threat of bankrupting the journalist with legal fees.
Thank you very much, Samer. That gives us a good understanding to start with. I'd like to move directly from the more general understanding of the concept of slaps to practical examples. So if I turn next to Rubina Čengić, experienced journalist and media consultant based in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And thank you especially, Rubina, for being with us, given that you have elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina only a few days from now. And I want to again remind our audience that if you want to hear the interpretation of Rubina's responses in English, to select the channel of English in the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. So Rubina, working as a journalist and working with journalists, as you do, especially in the Western Balkans region, can you give us practical examples of the use of slaps that you come across?
Yes, absolutely. I have to confess that I personally have not been exposed to a single slap suit, but I do many colleagues in our country, in the region, that have been faced with slap. Let me tell you this, colleagues from the Creek editorial board have been faced with real, actual slap suits to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. And in Croatia, they have 980 slap suits against different media to the tune of 10 million euros, and certain claims go up to 500,000 euros. Oftentimes what will happen is that persons filing such suits, they file them as private persons, but they are in most cases close to the authorities. And given that these processes take a long time, you never know how they will end and whether you will be fined, you will be issued a sanction. So journalists do work under a lot of pressure. In Croatia, we recently had a case where a judge sanctioned I think it was the Walter magazine, to write anything about care for children and young people. So that's entirely unacceptable. We all know what it means when a court places a ban to a media to write on a certain topic because there is a lawsuit against such a media. So this is unacceptable behavior which undermines the freedom of the media.
Thank you very much for that, Rubina. And let's continue with this notion of practical examples of slaps. Turning to you, Oleg Khomenok, Senior Media Advisor at Internews and member of the Board of Directors of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. I'm asking you basically a similar question to Rubina. Can you give us practical examples of slaps that you have come across in your work?
Yeah, and my examples are connected to investigative reporting, since it looks like this is the mostly, slaps are the mostly developed ways of fighting investigative reporting in a so-called legal way. First is from Ukraine, and it's about the investigation that was done by the Nashi Groshi with Denis Bigus, and it was actually revealing the system of the corruption in the Ukroboronprom, the defense ministry. The story had been published in 2018 and before the presidential elections. And then the people who were actually exposed in the investigation filed the lawsuit, the civil lawsuit against Bigus, and it took almost 3 years of the different levels of the court to finally got the decision that they are not guilty. And I also want to give another example that is not the civil code issues or civil code lawsuits, but this is, I think that SLAPP is also something that can be done in under criminal prosecution of the journalists. And our colleague in Kyrgyzstan, Bolat Temirov, had published the story about murky deals of the family of the chief of the security service of Kyrgyzstan, and he was until yesterday, when court finally released him, under criminal investigation, blaming him for the using drugs or selling drugs that were suddenly found in his office when the office was searched by the security service. But finally he was released, and the court considered that the evidences that have been provided by the law enforcement agencies are not evidently enough to convict this person. That's two stories that were the relatives of the high-ranked officials or high-ranked officials themselves might prosecute or try to prosecute the reporters who are revealing the truth.
Thank you very much, Oleg, for highlighting the wide range of activities by actors to stop journalists from doing their job. Let us look now at the issue of SLAPPs in other parts of Europe. We are happy to have with us Nick Williams, Policy and Campaigns Officer with the Index of Censorship. Nick, can you tell us talk a bit about SLAPPs as they're used in the United Kingdom?
Thank you, Magnus. I think the UK has a complex and enduring relationship with SLAPPs. London, for example, was named the town called Sue because of it sort of how common it is to be at the forefront of these sort of jurisdictional battles regarding SLAPPs, defamation, privacy, etc., etc. But it's also important to look at the UK jurisdiction as a jurisdiction that's really favorable to pursuers of SLAPPs. You can guarantee very high damages and a relatively amenable legal jurisdiction. And as a result, the legal jurisdiction and legal expertise based in the UK has been seen across Europe. A number of the cases directed at Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta before her assassination nearly 5 years ago involved a number of UK-based law firms who were providing legal expertise to people pursuing actions against her. And we see this in a lot of the cases that have been brought against journalists in the UK. Tom Burgess was 2 cases were submitted against him by the Eurasian Natural Resource Corporation for his book and reporting in the FT. ENRC had initiated over 18 proceedings against different journalists, investigators, lawyers, and even the Serious Fraud Office. And these were proceedings in both the UK and the US. Again, Paul Radu from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project was threatened with a legal action by an Azerbaijani politician. There was 2 years of pre-trial proceedings that took money, time, distraction away from reporting. And Radu is Romanian. The Azerbaijani politician, obviously based in Azerbaijan, the reporting was about Azerbaijan, but because of a very tenuous connection to the UK, it was ruled that they could bring an action in the UK. And this is an unfortunate trend that we see increasing, because around the lawyers, we also have an entire ecosystem of enablers. So lawyers, reputation management experts, PR firms, all of this that really supports this industry of bringing SLAPP actions to chill journalists, activists, academics, and campaigners. And also just like, so we define it as public participation, not political participation, because this is what really is a real freeze on freedom of expression, the right to assembly, and connected human rights.
Thank you very much, Nick. And let's continue exploring that ecosystem that you're referring to. So you also have the opportunity to talk to Anna Myers, Executive Director of the Whistleblowing International Network, and a member of the steering committee of the Coalition Against SLAPPs in Europe. Anna, going broader then, how would you say that SLAPPs are used in Europe?
Thanks very much. I think what we're seeing is an extension of using slaps against anyone that's involved in these investigations. So it does extend from journalists to sources and those who might comment sometimes on stories. So we've seen actually tweets being pursued when it's amplified a journalist story. There was a case in Turkey around that. In Ireland, there was a case where there was an injunction granted to a very wealthy businessman who didn't want his financial information published, and he had that granted. But then one MP used her parliamentary privilege to talk about the case, so they tried to sue again. And actually, the High Court then, in that decision, found that, of course, parliamentary privilege is stronger than even journalists' rights. So after that, of course, all the Irish journalists published the story. So you see them going after MPs who are quite right to question things in Parliament. And one of the areas in which we've seen it in the work that I do with whistleblowers is we've had a journalist in Italy, an 81-year-old editor who was disabled, actually go to jail because he refused to divulge his sources. But we've also seen the sources being pursued. So Jonathan Taylor, who was a UK lawyer working for a Monaco-based offshore oil industry company, and blew the whistle on corruption that was really all about the Brazilian briberies and the lavabo scandal the laundromat scandal we heard about. They sued him in the Netherlands, where he'd actually never worked, but SBM had jurisdiction, and they wanted him to apologize. So it was for defamation. They wanted him to publish a retraction. They said that he had brought their reputation disrepute by actually talking about their corruption instead, which is always an interesting thing. It's like, well, yes, you actually saw, you had to pay massive fines, and in the end, some of the senior management had gone to jail. So it's an odd thing to say we can't talk about this. And really, it put an individual who isn't supported in any way, and we're seeing this with journalists as well, who are not part of big media companies anymore, freelancers, really at the mercy of unlimited wealth, really, who know they're not going to make it very far, and they will pursue it as long as they can. And then at the first moment that the court put an interim decision against the company, they drop their damage request down to €1. So you can just see very quickly they didn't drop the case, they just put it out of court because they said we want €1 in the end. But the time, energy, stress, the effect on the individual, their families, and their financial well-being and their mental health is huge, whether you're professionally a journalist or a whistleblower doing their job and raising concerns, or you're someone tweeting, a social commentator, an academic, or an MP. So we're seeing it really spread in terms of who is targeted.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I think we now have a broader idea of what slaps mean. Let's move on to putting that in the context of the broader issues of media freedom and freedom of speech. And I want to go back to Nick, first of all. Nick, can you help us to talk about how the issue of slaps fit in within the broader context of media freedom?
I mean, you know, slaps uses, abuses, and morphs the legal environment within which journalists have to operate to become weapons that actually starts making the journalism itself impossible. So it's not just the individual legal act, it's not just the engagement of lawyers, courts, things like that, it's how it turns the entire system against the journalists, and it sort of isolates them. You know, for example, one of the tactics in slap actions is to target the journalists and not the outlets, because then the journalists themselves would have to, you know, bring up their own independent financing and also bear the emotional burden, which Samir talked about, of just the toll it takes on the individual and their willingness to keep writing. But also slaps, they don't happen in isolation. You know, this is just one tool that people can deploy to try and silence a story. Again, going back to the tragic story of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, she was sued, I think, about 60 times overall. I think 40 still after her death. You know, but at the same time, there were is incredible levels of online harassment, online threats. There were sort of, threats to her house, threats to her. So we need to see, when we talk about slaps, we need to see it as one tool that many perpetrators will deploy alongside others to silence journalism. And where can the journalists turn to? And if they don't have access to legal representation, and as Anna pointed out, it's even harder for freelancers. It's harder now where fewer news outlets have in-house legal counsel or can access high quality legal expertise outside because of diminishing ad revenue. So this is it really poisons the system around journalists, and it makes other threats possible because it's sowed that seed of doubt that this journalist reporting can't be trusted. If they promote enough the fact that why they're bringing this slap action, it makes it easier for others to also then target the journalist. So everything starts turning in on the journalists themselves, and they're isolated. And it's one of the tactics that I think people use because to silence it, because also slaps are dangerous even before it even gets to court. Getting to court is like the end of the journey. It's the months, the years of pre-trial hearings and all of the documentation you need to provide, and the intimidation that happens in that process as well. So this also draws attention from their ongoing work elsewhere as well.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I want to go back to you. We have a problem because Nick is talking about the role, and reporter's role, and the threats of slaps to journalists. The thing is, though, people don't trust journalists. Why should we care about this issue? Why does it matter for democracy, especially if journalists are spreading disinformation or are defaming people?
Well, I think the main issue is that democracies and accountability only work with information, and the public can only call those who govern them to account if they know what on earth is going on. And the governments also have a role in regulating private sector companies. So all of this is about the flow of information for accountability and for the public's right to know. And I think one of the things I just wanted to raise that I've sort of watched over the 20 years I've worked in whistleblowing is that we in a way, these laws that get set up to protect whistleblowers are almost like a reaction to the fact that information can flow much more quickly on social media, that actually these media houses, regulators have all lost their some of their function and some of their financing. So the kind of bodies that used to do some of the checking, so journalists in bigger organizations that had a whole team behind them who really could prepare the story and then respond quickly to any threats, those have gone. Regulatory authorities, government inspections, all of those other unions even that all had powers to hold power to account have all diminished in the last 20 years. And we're individualizing the risk of doing their jobs. And it's much easier to pick off the individuals who try to hold power to account, also to smear them, also to discredit them. So this, when you say we don't trust journalists, we've kind of undermined journalism, and we've let the noise of these cases and the way people use social media against each other to also create a smear that really, if you talk to individuals who talk about individual journalists, a lot of people do read newspapers, do quote what they hear. So it's a kind of, we don't trust it, but it's what we rely on. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think this is really, really important that we understand that this can't be up to individuals. We need to get in there and support these people who are trying to hold power to account. It's not fair. And so these laws, the ways that in which people are trying to respond, which we're going to talk about, is trying to give them some extra support.
Well, thank you very much for that. And let's indeed move on to the perspective from journalists. And Oleg, I want to talk to you first. You just gave us practical examples of slaps being used. Can I also ask you to talk about the trends that you see in this area and how slaps fit into the broader media landscape that you are working in? And you're muted.
Yeah, I want to talk about 2 points. First is that actually slap cases are targeted on a wider audience than just the reporter on one media. And the slap creates a kind of chilling effect when all other people are starting working for the media industry, starting to think whether they should touch some sensitive or dangerous cases. And the other context issue is that sometimes slap cases might not be actually directly connected to the publications produced by the media or reporter, as it happened in Kyrgyzstan, because after publication, the criminal case against the reporter was launched on the pretext of illegal drug use or drug sales. And that's, but evidently it was connected, and it was kind of revenge from the security services to the reporter. And that's another point. And finally, I think that it's also targeted to discredit the whole media community or investigative reporting community. And these slaps usually are targeted not only against the personal against reporter or the media, but also against the whole community to discredit whatever they are producing.
Thank you very much, Oleg. Over to you, Rubina, and I want to ask you pretty much the same question, because you, like Oleg, are working as a journalist and with journalists, from your perspective, more in the terms of Western Balkans. What trends are you observing, and how, from your perspective, do these slaps fit into the broader media landscape?
Well, precisely what Oleg just said. Those initiating slap cases, they don't provide any arguments. They do not accept that a media will issue a rebuttal. What they cite is abstract, emotional pain they've suffered. They demand expertise of their mental state. They submit supposed evidence about their emotional state. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have an excellent press council, which is a self-regulatory body for print and online media. But I have to say that very rarely will they go ahead with their complaints to the press council. They will immediately go to the court. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have a fairly better situation because we have a fairly solid defamation law. Slap suits are always in between defamation and this abstract accusation that someone has been inflicted some damage. Mrs. Anna mentioned that there are also slap suits against MPs and the like. At one point in time here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, this was 2 years ago, we had a large number of defamation cases amongst those holding high judicial positions. At one time, a large number of cases, lawsuits were filed against, they filed a large number of lawsuits against each other, and this brought our judiciary into a difficult situation because by suing each other, colleagues suing each other, they undermined practically the entire judiciary. And this indicated and clearly demonstrated the negative relationship between these people holding high judicial positions. A further problem with slap cases is that in our entire region of the Western Balkans, not a single country has in its legislation a definition of a lawsuit that would be an abuse of legal process. And there are also no sanctions for such abuse, which is also a very serious problem, and I think further contributes to an increase in the number of such cases, which are malignant because these cases take a long time, and as my predecessor said, they take a lot of time, money, energy, and sends a message to people in our professional community not to deal with serious cases, and people are slowly giving up on that. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have an excellent law on free access to information, but there's an increasing number of institutions closing up and don't want to receive information under that law. They shut themselves down, and then as journalists, you're forced to seek alternative sources of information, and when you do that, then you're more exposed to being faced with such suits for defamation or a slap suit, and this will also take a lot of time. And this is also dangerous for young journalists. Young people refuse to engage in investigative journalism or into dealing with more serious topics. So slap cases have not been described for nothing as a big threat to journalism and activism.
Thank you very much for that, Rubina. Samer, turning to you, we've focused the discussion on the European context, which is what we do in this discussion series. But I find that to understand the phenomena, it helps to look outside of the geographical area. You work with IFES on media and free speech programming. You're also based in North Africa. Can you talk about the situation in North Africa and indeed about the global South regarding media freedom and the role of SLAP in that?
Well, the situation of media freedom has never been so troubling across the board, unfortunately, and this includes the global South and in North Africa, where I'm currently based. The situation here has deteriorated in many countries. I mean, in Algeria, for instance, the situation has deteriorated since 2021. Many journalists have been imprisoned, prosecuted, or barred even from traveling. News sites have been blocked. Some publications critical of the government have also been financially strangled. In other places, such as Morocco, press freedom have declined significantly. There's also a few independent media outlets who remain in operation. The situation, if you look at Libya or Sudan, it's even direr, where the absence of a genuine government prevents the establishment of press freedom and acceptable working condition for reporters. And in addition, there have been also attempts to control broadcast media outlets, and the military is only present, especially in Sudan. The situation is somewhat less worrisome in Mauritania. There has been a democratic interlude in the late 2000s that saw the decriminalization of press offenses and a weakening of the repressive legal framework. But despite the government's assertion that it favors peaceful dialogue with the opposition, the journalists continue to find themselves in extremely precarious situations that encourage collusion, bias, and self-censorship because of vague laws. In Tunisia, where I'm based, freedom of the press and information are undeniable achievements of the revolution of 2011, but there are also serious concerns that have arisen since the consolidation of power by the current president, who decreed a ruling by decree. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, there has been a new decree number 54 that which calls into question the state of press freedom, because it's essentially nicknamed as the fake news decree. It's framed as combating misinformation and disinformation, but the definition is extremely vague in terms of how to pursue journalists who spread false information. So in North Africa, I would say that many SLAPs are state-based, unlike maybe in Europe. And they also come from powerful and wealthy individuals, such as business people or influential persons, still connected to the state apparatus, because the legal framework has been made to offer that type of various interpretation that gives security forces, you know, and in the case of Tunisia, many journalists have been prosecuted in military courts, which is against international standards that Tunisia has ratified. So the state is in a way there. If you're looking at SLAPs in terms of private entity, I would say that in this part of the world, it's still a state-based enterprise.
Thank you very much, Samer. And you highlight an issue there about how to target disinformation without restricting free speech, which was the topic of an earlier online discussion that we had. So for anyone who's particularly interested and want to follow up on that, just recommend you to go to our YouTube channel and find further information. Right, so we've talked about the problems, and thank you very much, Samer, for that depressing but interesting answer. let's look at solutions. Let's start by looking at the principles for how we can effectively counteract the slaps and their impact against media freedom. Anna, I want to turn to you first. If we consider principles for counteracting slaps, what, from your perspective, is the most important things to do?
There's multifaceted ways of approaching it. I think the main thing that we've found is the collaboration. So all these people who are being targeted now are seeing themselves as sharing a common ground and a common threat. And the common ground is protecting the public interest and access to information, the public's right to know. And that comes in many forms, whether it's NGOs doing investigations or journalists or whistleblowers or whatever. And the public, as I said, tweets and academics also have been targeted. So it's about coming together and seeing ourselves as a much greater force than we certainly are in these cases where we get individualized and stuck with a much bigger problem than is really that the imbalance of power is huge. So we start to rebalance the balance of power when we work together. So that's very important. What CASE has been doing and started off very early on was really investigating the problem. So it's about exposing slaps and who are using them and who are enabling them. And then also, because of the incredible breadth of skills, experience, actually, and when you collaborate, it's about building resilience to slaps. So this network isn't just about saying we all have a big problem. We all actually, there are so many skills, and I know that there are so many skills in North Africa, for instance, to do journalism in countries where that has been under pressure for a long time, in the global south for a long time, and you see that actually there's lots of skills and tactics that we need to share and use. So that's part of it, which can be providing early legal assistance. It can be providing campaign assistance, so we immediately get these things out of the closet and we start to expose them. And that's, they don't, people who are saying their reputation's at stake for the story also don't like their reputation at stake for using the system abusively. Emergency funding where is needed. And then, of course, there's the advocacy for law reform. And one of the things that CASE has been able to get going so quickly, really, when you think about sort of really coming together, the problem has been growing, the damage has been happening for a long time, and the knowledge has been building. And then once they got together and CASE was formed, the fact that the European Commission is looking at as drafting legal principles is incredible. So you're getting a lot coming together at the same time, and it's a moving piece. So the collaboration, the common ground, law reform is a great way to keep us together, but it's not going to be it's a beginning of another phase, and it's not the entire solution. It's very important.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Nick, over to you. How do you see the key aspects of counteracting slaps?
I mean, I agree with everything Anna just said, to be honest. I think when we acknowledge that slaps are a structural, systemic threat to public participation, we then see all the different actors and the different ways that we need to respond. Collaboration is key. We also have in the UK, we have a UK anti-slap coalition, similar to CASE and feeds into CASE as one of the national coalitions. And this has really helped us bring, as Anna says, collaborate, but also collaborate across different disciplines. So we have journalist organizations, lawyers, academics, pro-transparency, anti-corruption organizations, and they're able to bring all of this different expertise together to help see what the best way is to navigate this. And then through that expertise, you see the different things that you can lean on. For example, is there a regulatory regime for lawyers that needs to get more involved? We've been working, and the Solicitors Regulatory Authority in the UK has acknowledged that slaps is a growing problem and are looking at amending some of their guidance on the actions of solicitors. So looking at that way, but also so much of this, and again, as Anna said, is visibility. Slaps work when the person targeted is on their own, is isolated, and is not able to go public with the threat that they face. Because, and sometimes, there is a risk of going public, of course, but working with others can help make sure that the public sees what is happening. Because obviously, you know, the problem is if they happen in silence, the public is like, why aren't the press covering this issue? And then, you know, there will be a decreased trust from the public into journalists. But actually, the journalists could be saying, well, we're trying to, but I've been facing legal letters from 5 different individuals and, you know, I can't. So I think that legal reform, it is not the golden bullet, but it's a really important step. UK has announced plans for a UK anti-SLAPP mechanism in response to Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine. It's a positive step. And it talks about things like Rubina mentioned, the idea of sanctions against people who are bringing SLAPP actions, making sure that they can't just keep doing it and there's no risk to them. But also there's broader things, access to legal funds, access to legal expertise, and being able to advocate. But for everyone on this call, if they're worried about SLAPPs in their country, like bring together organizations, bring together as wide a diverse network as you can, start talking about it, start looking at your jurisdiction and what levers can be pulled to tackle this issue. I think the UK Anti-SLAPP Coalition has been a really important vehicle to bring together these people who may have thought they were alone in dealing with these issues, because ultimately, unfortunately, they seldom are alone, because this issue is growing.
Thank you very much, Nick. Rubina, again, from a journalistic perspective and your experience, what do you see as the key aspects of counteracting SLAPPs?
Yes, I will agree with all my predecessors. I think, yes, that journalists need to come together more strongly, and that we need to also work on educating and training people in the judiciary. We cannot prevent people filing lawsuits. We have excellent examples in Serbia where a group of activists filed a lawsuit against a company exploiting forests. The owners of that company sue the founder of that non-governmental organization, which dared to fight such a. So we have no way to prevent human malice. We are having a difficult time even fighting crime. But the journalists could come together. We in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we do have a successful and strong association of BIA journalists, which submits initiatives practically on a daily basis, and it comes together with other similar associations in the region. I think that's what we can do. We need to work together, collaborate, and also to formulate demands for change, but also to work on educating judges. The only persons that can help us in this case, at least how I see it, are the judges, who should learn more about the issue of SLAPPs. SLAPP cases, how to recognize them, to reject them. If you can't sanction those filing them, the claimants, then those who file SLAPP suits, SLAPP cases are in most cases connected to the state. And the judges can help us in that. In this region, by and large, they are protected by their reputation, high salaries, and we can seek their better training. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, we are a divided country, as you all know. At the level of the entity, we have centers for the education of judges and prosecutors. And we've been told that each judge and prosecutor is required to attend some form of professional development 5 hours annually. And they, in most cases, on their own seek topics on which to receive additional training. And we demanded that they be further trained on the rights of journalists and our profession, and also topics that in most cases journalists work on, so that they can better understand what is it that we journalists do and what are the risks that this profession brings about, and also what are the gaps that pose a threat to journalists, such as these SLAPP cases. So I see a big role in training here in training journalists, but also judges, and in addition to legal changes, I don't see what else can be done.
Thank you very much, Rubina. Sama, again, we want to draw on your experience from North Africa. What do you see as the way forward?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with my colleagues. I think a coalition of journalists network, but also, I mean, in the case of Tunisia, there's a strong journalist union here. So I think they're also part of the equation, and they've been very vocal about the political turn that the country has taken. But I think civil society and lawmakers should also be part of this conversation to pass anti-SLAPP laws. When it comes to courts, I think, like my colleague said, I think courts have generally done a terrible job in either identifying at any early stage or ultimately redressing such litigation and almost never preventing the harm in the first place. So procedural rules themselves are amenable to being abused so long as the abusive party is able to draft a pleading that can withstand an ordinary motion to dismiss. So I think, as Rubina said, ensuring attorneys and judges are extremely knowledgeable about SLAPP is a must. But the problem also when it comes specifically to North Africa is that the issue is beyond SLAPP. It's the, as I mentioned earlier, it's the vague legal framework that could pursue journalists under very spurious claims of spreading false news, even though that premise is a double standard. As many powerful people, ironically, these are the same who pursue SLAPP, are principal carriers of disinformation, yet they're not, they're untouched by the law when it comes to that. One thing to also remember is that most countries in the world have ratified the ICCPR, and which includes Article 19. So it's very also important to building alliances across borders. Journalist collaboration is a vector for strengthening the fourth estate, in my opinion. And as we've seen many times, whistleblowing becomes much more successful when you have a collaboration of journalists. We've seen that with the Panama Papers, with the Pandora Papers, when we had hundreds of journalists and media outlets from dozens of countries collaborating together. And I think the same could also apply when it comes to SLAPPs.
Thank you, Samer. And Oleg, you're part of that type of cooperation between journalists. From a journalist's perspective, what do you see as the solution?
Well, I think that it depends on the country that we are talking about, since it seems to me that for Belarus and Russia, the only solution for the SLAPP defense is just leaving the country and working in exile, as a lot of our colleagues are doing now. But talking about the some remedies, I think that there are two aspects. First is legal. It depends of how developed is the legislation that is regulating media freedom and freedom of access to public information and all this stuff. And also among the legal aspects, the creation of the pool of media lawyers in a country like we did it in Ukraine, and actually it helps a lot in fighting with the SLAPP cases and protecting reporters on three stages. First is when reporter is collecting information, helping him or her to gather information based on the Freedom of Information Act. Second is the legal vetting that might prevent some negative consequences in a court before the publication. That's not the censorship, that's just helping a reporter to be sure that everything that he or she is stating in the story is proven by the appropriate proofs. And the third stage is defending in a court in case the lawsuit is launched. And this is one part, and the second is real professional collaboration and readiness to support reporters in following on the story that was published and sued, and having this solidarity issues and publicity of the SLAPP cases, collecting the good examples or success stories, and initiating public debate about the influence of the public officials and their attempts to shut down media or to punish reporters.
Thank you very much, Oleg. Let's now finally go from principles of solutions to practical examples, actions and activities to address this issue. And Rubina, I want to turn to you first. Looking at practical solutions from your perspective, looking at the issue from your journalistic perspective, what would be practical examples, practical activities that can be done?
I don't know if I already mentioned this moments ago, although I did intend to do so. We lost Rubina, I'm afraid.
I think we've lost Rubina there.
Okay, we have her back. We have a I just explained to Rubina that we lost her for a moment, so she's with us again. I wanted to say this. It was in April this year that we had a big regional conference in Sarajevo of journalists from Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. And among other issues, we also discussed slap cases and what to do about this issue. And I think that we all agree that what favors us is this EU directive and that we should use it and use it to create pressure on the authorities to change legislation. We're having a difficult time with this. I've heard Oleg moments ago that the authorities are not all that immune in this entire process, but it's difficult to force them to engage in change and to make changes. Claimants are in most cases close to those in power, and oftentimes what happens is they are doing and filing such cases to protect those in power because they're serving in their interest. But as I mentioned moments ago, I think that there are two key issues: legal change and to clearly define slap cases and to provide a possibility to sanction those referring to slap cases. That would be one thing. And the other thing would be training and educating judges. I think I also said this before, you lost me. I think what favors us is that we're all faced with the same problem, that we can work together and that we have now support in this recommendation from the European Commission, which aims at protecting journalists from slap cases. I think we need to come together, perhaps IFES, which has people in all these countries, could serve as a link, bring this together, and then take into account all these initiatives, aggregate them, prepare a single one, send that back to the governments, and then that we all lobby together. I think this relationship of the media towards the problems that media and the journalists, we as journalists write about the problems of all various categories of the population and very little about our own problems. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we don't even have a serious union, labor union. We are under a different branch union, and now we're only talking about how to set up and form a union of journalists that would protect the labor rights of us, the journalists. Many people confuse the responsibilities of the Association of Journalists and the labor union. These are two separate things, two different issues. One is protecting professional rights, the other one is protecting labor rights. Unfortunately, there is a lot of problems and we are skipping from one problem to another. But with reference to these slap cases, I think legal change and educating judges would be the way ahead.
Thank you very much, Rubina. Oleg, do you agree? What do you see as the practical solution?
Yeah, in all points that Rubina just said, I agree with her, and just want to add that Magnus, as a Swedish, you might know how the system of the self-governance of the media or self-regulation of the media is working in Sweden, and I think that that might be one of the solutions for Ukraine, at least, since it creates the system when the complaints are not going to the court, but to the ombudsman or to the media council, whatever it would be called, and then considered, and it gives an opportunity for the people to avoid the legal consequences or spending time and money in the court. And I agree with Rubina that there is a need to distribute the knowledge and skills among the judges or the court system about the European Court of Human Rights decision, since those countries that ratified the European Convention for the Human Rights, there are a lot of decisions of the European Court that are connected to the freedom of speech, to the protection of the sources, and whatever other else issues are raised when slap case is appearing. And in Ukraine, there is a law that states that the European court decisions are part of the domestic legislation, and they should be used by the courts when they are considering cases in case of the freedom of speech in the Chapter 10. And that might be also another practical solution. And in Ukraine, we had several trainings for the judges of the Supreme Court, on the administrative courts, and then the other courts dedicated to the implementing of the European legislation or European decisions into the Ukrainian ground.
Thank you very much, Oleg. Anna, I'm turning to you. You work with the Coalition Against Slaps in Europe. Among other things, the coalition runs campaigns against slaps. what's been the lessons learned from that, and what do you think is the impact?
Well, the campaigns have been quite wonderful. The campaign to sort of name the SLAP winner of the year, so it's a little bit based on the Eurovision Song Contest, but the humor, the making it accessible to the public, those kind of campaigns are really important. But I think when you're thinking about as a group, again, as I mentioned, the thing about collaborations and even across what we call in the sort of civil society, it's still across professional divides, right? There's journalists and there's lawyers that work for NGOs, and in some ways, sometimes these organizations are seeking the same funding, used to see themselves as slightly in competition from trying to survive. And now they're coming together. So the skill set is incredible. So when the collaboration has been happening, there have been parts of the case coalition. So there's different working groups. There's a legal working group. There's an advocacy working group. There's a campaign working group. And they're all doing slightly different things. Some of them are going to overlap, but they're talking to the Council of Europe. They're not just waiting for the Commission. They're thinking about it nationally. They're doing the research and pulling out the information in reports, which are going to be valuable for a long time, because the practical examples are what really makes people stand up, policymakers stand up. They like to hear what's really happening, not just the theory. So that when you're talking about why you need an early dismissal mechanism in any law, you're explaining through a real process of the toll and damage that 3 or 4 years of fighting a case can take on an individual. So these early dismissal mechanisms are really important. So there's some main principles that are really important there. But I think what Oleg and Rubina have been saying, and Oleg saying, it will depend. There are moments when all you can do is leave a country. Then you also need a community to support you. Or what you're doing is much more about baby steps. So you're not going to be as loud. You're going to be making smaller steps and smaller connections. The other thing I would say is, one of the things that I've seen is anti-corruption agencies, for instance, around the world will say, we find out about what's going on through the journalism, through journalist stories. We actually look for them in order to do our jobs, because they don't have ways to get information. So we need to get perhaps some of the non-obvious partners. Within the whistleblowing field, for instance, compliance officers in banks found themselves suddenly in this position of having to blow the whistle. So compliance professional associations have been very supportive of whistleblowers going outside organizations to regulatory bodies or public bodies. So these are not, sometimes there are partners out there that you are not used to thinking about, that you really need to be aware of. I do think the other point that Samer made, which I think is really important, is if this is a systemic problem, the law that will deal with SLAPs, we need to be watching the space that governs public access to information, all the secrecy laws, all the laws that are meant to regulate information, like cybersecurity, the different disinformation laws, national security laws, trade secrets laws, for instance. They've all had an impact on whistleblowing and journalists' rights and access to information. So we do need these wider partners that are interested in other things and go, look, these are all affecting what we all believe in. So I think that's what I've learned, is that there's an incredible wealth of skills. You can then respond very quickly. You can use one case as a really good example, and you can be actively campaigning and making all the connections to help that individual, but explain what it means to the public interest more widely, to legislate, to the policymakers as well as to the public.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Nick, you with the Index of Censorship, you have a tool which I find fascinating that you call "Am I Facing a SLAP?" ? Can you tell us a little bit about that and the impact that it has had?
Okay, first off, I will say it is not legal advice. I feel like that's an important proviso. But the thing we notice, and what we've all talked about here, is just the complexity of dealing with SLAPs. No one SLAP, no two SLAPs are the same, no three SLAPs are the same. And also, there are legitimate uses of laws if reporting has violated the law. So there can be legitimate uses of defamation law, etc., etc. What this tool does is a very simple. It's literally a series of multiple choice questions to sort of dissect a threat that comes into you, and even before it's actually an actual threat, it's like the proceedings, and it sort of just disentangles it step by step. So it shows you the tactics on a very granular level of a slap, and it helps you look at what's proportionate, what's disproportionate, what is an abuse of a system. Because so much of this, because people don't come forward, because there's so much fear in coming forward, that gives people who are perpetrating slaps a huge amount of space to work with. They can present something that's totally ludicrous and disproportionate, something that we may define as a slap, as totally legitimate, just in the way that they approach the journalist, and the journalist knowing that they may not be able to disentangle it from, they may not be able to label it as an abusive process. So looking at this, it helps you look at, journalists will receive letters from people all the time, and some of the requests may be legitimate, and they may be proportionate to what is being deemed inappropriate, like in their coverage. And generally you hope that being a constructive relationship, and then, that's it. But this will help you see what is disproportionate. I've seen legal letters, for example, that ask for changes that say, "I now promise never to write about us ever again." In no way is that proportionate, irrespective of the journalism that is at the target of it. So this tool is just to help you navigate that process when dealing with someone who's threatening a slap. And I think, but we see it as a part of a wider set of advocacy tools that we can help both dissect, but also bring into light and bring, as in Anna's words, sort of out of the closet. And so I've put the link in the chat. It's got that tool as well as some of the reports that we've written on it. And it's been a really interesting way, because people do use it, and it's a really interesting way of, we don't capture any data, so it's totally anonymous as well. This is not someone, we don't want it to be seen like someone sort of outing themselves as a slap victim if they haven't gone public. But it's a really powerful tool just to sort of demystify it and bring it down to very practical ground level terms.
Thank you very much, Nick. And final question goes to you, Samer. What is IFES doing to support freedom of speech and media freedom in Europe and beyond?
So IFES is an organization that works on strengthening democracies across the globe, has also starting to find a niche in looking at the relationship between media and democracy, and that those are intertangled with each other. And IFES uses a wide range of tools to achieve these objectives. This includes conducting media landscape analysis, looking at providing technical support and advice on the legal and regulatory reform surrounding media, working with journalists and other type of professional journalists, freelance journalists, citizen journalists, and conducting trainings on electoral coverage, but also the broader civic education aspects as well. We have also done some research-based assistance to media outlets in correlation with electoral events as well. And one of the things is what we always keep in mind is that in addition to being watchdogs, journalists are also our civic educators. So if we work on civic education, for us, they are part of this important equation, and therefore they have to be part of making sure that issues that we're facing challenges today, such as misinformation and disinformation, making sure that fact checking is conducting in a very meticulous way, is also covered as part of our work. We've done also some training on abuse of state resources for journalists, so they can pave the way for investigation as well, which is also connected to SLAPS in that regard. We've also incorporated the use of technology for journalists and how to collect data, how to conduct data scraping and visualize it to make sure that the readers are interested in the visual aspects of it and can understand an image better than reading an article or whatnot. We've also focused on specific type of specialities here, such as inclusion journalism in countries where we want to ensure that diverse voices, especially at the local levels, are represented. And essentially, what we do, our motto essentially is that ensuring independent journalism would essentially lead to an increase in access to information. And the mistrust of journalists that you spoke of, Magnus, earlier on, is probably also based to the role of, or maybe the stigmatization of journalism in some capacity, such as the role of corporate media in particular, as opposed to independent journalism or local journalism or investigative journalism, because this is where money talks essentially, and this is where the most audiences get their source of information, at least in many places around the world. So we feel that this is also to bring back this trust, is to ensure that their voice is heard, and that also the access to information to the audience is also provided in a give and take more equitable way.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that. And thank you to all our panelists for your inputs. We'll move now to questions. If anyone has a question, type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And while you do that, I'm going to read out some questions that have come in already. But before I do that, I should mention that several of our panelists, and also Ivan Godarski from our partner organization Memo 98, media organization based in Slovakia, has put some very useful links in the chat. And to make sure that that's available to everyone, we'll put it in the video description on our YouTube channel. One question has come in, and it's, I guess, mainly aimed to Anna, is we've spoken mainly about SLAPS in the context of journalists. What about the connection between SLAPS and whistleblowing? And the question is also, can whistleblowing protection help to counteract SLAPS?
Yeah, I think it's all part of a piece. I think we managed, in some ways, to our surprise, to turn around a directive quite quickly before the last election of the European Parliament, and that was where actually the level of understanding at the Commission level had been really low. They basically didn't see any way in which the European model, the treaties, would cover this at all. In the end, they found it to be a transversal subject, and I think that I hope, whether it's direct or not, has kind of laid the ground for the anti-SLAP, because in fact, it was the murders of Daphne Caruana Galizia and the Slovakian journalist and his partner who that actually got them talking about whistleblowing protection. And then the whistleblowing protection doesn't actually deal directly, although it does allow for individuals to go public who are in a working relationship to go public. And I always find that interesting. You get political will to kind of have to do something, and then you answer a slightly different question. Nothing wrong with that. But now we're dealing with SLAPS. And I think that the link between the whistleblowing is that journalists as well, journalist sources can often be whistleblowers, those with inside information. So journalists are getting much better and much more aware of whistleblowing, partly because, again, the funding and the tools and the ability to do investigative journalism has been reducing, and people are relying on sources. And we've got so much information sometimes coming out, and then we have to have journalists working together who may have before found themselves arguing or trying to get at a story. Now they're like, we have to work together because there's so much information. So there's I don't think we've all become great, wonderful people suddenly. I think there's a reality that we have to work together, that the authorities aren't doing their jobs very well. Whistleblowers are telling us what's going on. Whistleblower protection is one step along the way to source protection and journalist protection, and we're all part of the same family. I still think there's a bit of work to be done from my experience with working with journalists of what whistleblowers are and what they are when they're not yet a source or before they're a source, and why that's also important to the ecosystem and the protection of the ecosystem in which journalism operates. So I think there's still some misunderstanding there, but I can see the two being very, very linked, and they're all part of this important democracy and accountability project that we're all engaged in.
Thank you, Anna. And Nick, I know you want to come in on this, so I'm going to add a question to you before I do, so you can answer both questions. since you're working with the Index on Censorship, and I'm going to read out the question. What would you say to those who argue that laws against slaps can be seen as a form of censorship in themselves, in that such laws can discourage those who feel that they have been defamed from seeking redress in courts? Feel free to answer either or both of questions.
I mean, just quickly on the previous question, I think also, I mean, this goes back to the idea that slaps poisons the entire media ecosystem. So not just the journalists who report, but the sources of information, whether that be a source or a whistleblower. And if, for example, you know, if a journalist, if we know there's an industry that's incredibly litigious, or a company or an individual that's incredibly litigious, and a whistleblower comes up from that industry wanting to, you know, what's the likelihood and what's the appetite for the journalist to you know, to support the whistleblower, to ensure they've got all the protections from the journalist's side? You know, if you can't report, if you're not able to report, you're not able to take the information and work with the whistleblower to tell that story. So I think slaps, we need to think this as an environmental harm, not just as a one node within the environment. In terms of anti-slap, you know, I mean, this is why, you know, defining slaps, as Samir had the unfortunate task of doing, is incredibly complicated. But, you know, but so much of our work is, we're not saying that people cannot use defamation law if they have been defamed. You know, we differentiate between, you know, proportionate usage of defamation laws. You know, defamation laws that are rights respecting. There's a serious harm threshold. There's a public interest offence. You know, all of these things. There's, when that law is proportionately developed and applied in court, that, you know, anti-slap mechanisms will not get in the way of people using the courts to protect their reputation. Because obviously there is this, you know, balance between the right to the private life, which courts have held to include reputation, as well as a free expression. But this isn't, a lot of this is not that case. It's abusing that legal system to go beyond what would be a legitimate defamation case to ensure all scrutiny, because this is attacking scrutiny, this is attacking democratic accountability, it's attacking, you know, us being able to have all the information that we need as a society to make the important decisions. And anti-slap laws, the ones that we're, you know, a lot of us are fighting for, would not get in the way of that. It would just add far more protections for those laws being abused. And that's where slaps are, and that's where we need political and civil society sort of visibility on.
Thank you very much, Nick. I see, Rubina, you want to come in on this as well?
Yes, just briefly, I wanted to comment on this issue, that we supposedly now should be very careful that our too strong a voice against slap cases, that this could somehow lead to people being exposed and their reputation being put at risk. Yes, I mean, I think it's important to note that we should not fall prey to this, and we shouldn't fall into this trap. And there's one other thing, important thing I wanted to say, but I now forgot. My apologies.
Thank you very much, Rubina. There are a lot of more questions and a lot of things that we could discuss for a very long time, but we have come to the end of our time together. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank all of you for participating in this discussion. I again want to thank USAID for supporting this event and my IFES colleagues. The next installment in this series will be held on October the 27th. And the specific topic for that event will be announced in the near future. I hope to see you all in that discussion. Until then, stay safe.